Welcome to Ghosted by the Machine, the podcast where job seekers break through the algorithm and finally get heard. No filters, no bots, just 5 minutes of truth. I'm your host, Mark Lane, and today we're flipping the mic a little. We're talking to two voices who spend their time inside the HR and talent world, but who aren't afraid to talk about what's really happening behind the scenes. Let's get into it. 5 minutes, 5 questions. Today's guests are Jill Coniglio-Kirk and Joe Shanbaum, co-hosts of Talent Revolution, Tales from the Trenches. Jill and Joe, welcome to Ghosted by the Machine.
Thanks,
Mark,
Mark,
for having us.
So what inspired you both to launch your podcast? For anyone meeting you for the first time, give us a little bit about your backgrounds.
So usually ladies first, but I'll go first on this one, Joe, because of the podcast piece. So hi, everyone. Joe Shanbaum, 20 plus years in talent acquisition in a variety of different forms, corporate, third party, currently at the Headhunters, enjoying finding talent and supporting our customers in a variety of businesses. And the inspiration behind the podcast is a couple things. I've had several folks say, Joe, you should start a podcast. And I said, great. But what are we going to talk about? What do people really want to hear? And what's going to be value added? And through the career, I came up with this idea of, and not an idea, but it felt like there was a gap in HR and TA and the connection coming together, and really wanted to share the perspectives from those different avenues and the different areas and give that back to folks, because it can be related to small, medium, and large size companies, and really to help bridge those teams together to be more effective. So that was my idea and premise. And I called Jill, and Jill was like, yeah, that sounds like fun. And here we are. At least that's what she's told me.
Yeah. And I guess I will use the words of one of our famous episodes. She said yes. So Joe called me. I got the phone call immediately. I think it actually started as a note, Joe. If I recall correctly, I got a note from Joe and I thought, that's crazy. Why would I ever do this? Right. And then within a short amount of time, same day, I was like, you know what? I recognize that there's a need for these real conversations. There is a void, I think, of just real talk. You know, what's really happening? What are the lessons and what are the tactics and what are the daily triumphs, right? The daily grinds that people are going through. So I kind of looked at it and said, you know what? This fell in my lap for a reason today. I'm going to say yes before I have too much time to backpedal or chicken out. And that's pretty much how it started. You know, Joe was looking for someone who was an HR leader with a diverse background. I've pretty much been in the HR profession over 25 years, all of in a generalist type role, in a generalist leadership role in the auto industry. And I felt like this seemed like a perfect opportunity to kind of, you know, share some of my views, share some of my lessons learned, help figure some of this stuff out with other people. And most importantly, build a community of people that could really talk to each other and not just talk about, you know, the butterflies and unicorns of the HR world, right? Or the textbook type things, you know, how are we going to have these real stories and how are we going to help support each other and build a sense of community? So here we are, and happy to be part of your journey here, Mark. Thanks for having us.
Well, I appreciate you guys being on today. And Joey had something else to add?
Yeah, I mean, the core of it, like when Jill and I started talking, was the stories, right? Because that's really where people get related to what really happened and how could it help them in the future and see. And, you know, we don't want to be textbook. We want to be able to be real, get into the details, share experiences so people could relate. And that's why we made it the Tales from the Trenches, because there are war stories that we've been through and our guests have been through.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure we can probably spend about 2 hours talking about ghost stories. Well, speaking of real stories, when you hear real stories from people actually doing the work, how does that shift the conversation compared to the polished HR talk we usually hear?
I guess I could take this one first. I think it takes courage to be vulnerable and to not sugarcoat things, right? So I think a bit of where I'm coming from is saying, you know, this work is hard, it's messy. And if we could really have those types of conversations and share practical advice for one another, then maybe we will actually find solutions together, right? So for me, it's really about a bit of being willing to be vulnerable, maybe sometimes being a little silly, right? And just how do you get other people to open up and really want to start more of a movement to really tackle problems, right? How do we make a difference? How do we get through this together? How do we lean on each other?
And everybody learns a little differently, right? And I know from my college and education and just through the career was watching and seeing other experiences. So the tales and the stories really help resonate with me, which then I can relate to others. And that's what I'm hoping other folks take out of this of, it's not the exact thing that's happening to them, but there's stuff enough relatable that they could then apply it and not have to go through everything themselves.
So that's good. And it's a process for us job seekers out there to wade through this. And it's always we need there's no book on this right now. There's no map, there's no instructions manual. We are flying by the seat of our pants. So it's good to get someone or a story from individuals like you to give us something so we can then take it and hopefully run with it and get better at this. We talk a lot about ghosting on this show. It's not just about candidates. HR teams feel it too. Where do you see the communication breakdown the most and what needs to change?
I'll start on this one from my side, and I'm not trying to throw them under the bus, but our hiring managers a lot of the times are frustrating, right? We're recruiting, we're trying to find the right people, and then they don't get back to us, right? And you're trying to manage that aspect and get the communication because you go through the applications, you go through your own sourcing, you do all this due diligent work, and then it's like sits on their desk or sits in their email. And you could go to their desk, you can hound them, and then it stops. Frustrating for the candidate because they're like, well, hey, it's been a week. What's going on? And you follow up saying, I don't have any information. And it keeps going. And it's a frustration that you're trying to shorten the process and move it through, but it ends up delaying things, and then the communication gets broken down and it gets frustrated for everybody, right? Because the candidates go on to another role or another situation, and then the leadership or the metrics keep on the inside, guys, the pile up on that side of it, then it's like, what's going on? Why aren't we filling these roles? Or whether it's third party or corporate, and it's a bottleneck a lot of the times, and you can stranglehold into that situation, and you can make an agreement of we're going to get feedback in 24 to 48 hours. But this meeting came up and this customer happened and this thing happened. And unfortunately, it elongates things. And again, some communication is better than nothing. And I hope more recruiters are doing that for candidates. But I see that's one of the bigger bottlenecks in my world. Jill?
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point. And I think a lot of people in the talent acquisition and HR side of things feel like, well, do I really have control over those other people in this process? So it kind of becomes this very drawn out, long kind of finger pointing game rather than, how do we come together and achieve what we all want to do to be successful in the timeline? And I think there's some strategies there to think about if you're experiencing something like this in your own organization. Like Joe said, distractions come up, and it's really starting with kind of maybe a face-to-face meeting and having some alignment on how frequently are we going to talk? How are we going to achieve that? How are we going to keep this in front of us? So sometimes structure and talent acquisition and HR having structure with leaders helps that, right? And say, we're going to agree that we talk every 5 days, right? And we put this time on our calendar and we go through a certain process. So sometimes structure leads to at least sticking a little bit closer to those commitments and really not ending up in this, blame game, I guess, and finger pointing game that cause a lot of delays in the process. At the end of the day, we all need to stick to the timelines to be successful, to have our organizations be successful, and that it also creates a positive experience for the candidate because let's be real, people are spending a lot of time. They're starting an interview process. Maybe it takes 3 months to get through the process. That's crazy, right? We need to kind of get back to the basics and maybe even just set some goals and targets internally saying, how long is our goal, right? And then what steps are we going to take and how are we going to all do this in the most efficient way to hit those numbers, right? So I do think, Joe's point about hiring leaders are part of it. I think the other part of it is we're more focused on moving things through a system than actually having real conversations and making real decisions, right? I think in some sense, technology is great, but sometimes it creates noise for us and it creates barriers for us rather than it being an enabler for us. So I think we all have to ask ourselves questions on how do I look at the technology and the tools that I now have to do this? And how do I get the right outcomes and outputs and timelines using them rather than letting them drive us, if that makes sense?
Right. And when you say technology, I guess the big bad word is AI, or words, artificial intelligence. I spoke to someone the other day in talent acquisition, and he was saying that, I get 500 resumes, and then I use AI to go through those keywords and spits out 10. So what about the other 490? What was wrong with those? We
Mm-hmm.
don't know. But they're relying on that AI. There's no more of that human connection. I had a chat with another talent acquisition organization. I saw a job. I applied for it. I contacted them the next day. They say, "Hey, I just want to let you know I applied for this, and can you give me some, let me know what's going on with the process." I get a note back 24 hours later. "Oh, just to let you know, he's already, or the client already has some resumes right now on his desk. I don't know if he's going to be looking at any others. But I'll let you know if you're passes the test." And I was like, "Why didn't you take down that post? Why are you still collecting applications?" If I went in and spent 45 minutes updating my resume to make sure I had the right keywords in that application, and I applied, sent him a cover letter that I rewrote, and this job isn't going to happen. I'm not even going to see it's not going to see the light of day. So again,
Yeah.
these are some of the other pitfalls that are happening through the process.
Right. And I see that one being an example of letting the process drive things rather than having a person with judgment decide how they're going to use those tools and how they're going to approach this to get the outcomes they need. And to your point, could those 490 candidates be better than the 10? I think they could. So I think everyone needs to ask themselves those questions. How do I want to use this in the best way? The whole point of it is to drive efficiency, but it's not the Holy Grail. Let's be real. We all know it's not the Holy Grail. So I think it's doing some experimentation, maybe taking an exercise of two different roles, maybe similar roles, and saying, I'm going to do one this way and one that way. What did I learn through this? How could I maybe take the best of both worlds and try to iterate this process so I can integrate some automation that does drive some efficiency or take some time out? I think a lot of people have just lost their way with they don't even know how or where to start with all that.
So, question number 4, across all conversations you've had, what's one pattern or aha moment that you think, talent leaders really need to pay attention to right now? We just talked about AI, we talked about human touch, keywords. What is one thing that these talent leaders really need to pay attention to?
Personally think the talent leaders and all leaders need to pay attention to the candidate experience and the brand and the reflection their experiences to the people they're trying to hire. Because I honestly feel like I hear so little in the way of good news there and positive experiences there that I think everyone really needs to take a step back and say, if I were on the other side of this, how would my view of this company be? And then how do I position the work I'm doing and the process I'm putting together to make sure that it's not a grueling, unpleasant, dehumanizing experience for that person. So I personally think it's really all about evaluating the other side of the equation. What is it like for a candidate? And how would you view it if you were on the other side of this? The old parental advice where mom always said, treat other people the way you want to be treated. Sometimes it's really getting back to basics. So that would be my take on where I think we could go and achieve a lot better progress in the right direction.
And I guess to piggyback on it, it just goes into the communication, right? It's communication to internally, externally, because that drives the view, the experience for candidates, for hiring leaders, for HR, for anyone, business leaders, right? It's communication that really, aligns the whole process.
And I'm sure these companies are seeing it. I'm sure they don't want the negativity to hurt their brand. I talked on your show about Canada signing into law, the ghosting law. So we'll see if that comes to the Americas. I'm not sure, but I believe that HR and talent acquisitions have to realize this down the road.
Yeah, it's just the metric behind that, right? How are they going to know, what that brand deficiency is? Maybe less candidates applying, or the interest in them and different things that way. It's going to potentially affect them, but how? I'm curious on what that realization is and what how can they get the data for showing that it's hurt their
Well,
brand?
I mean, if it's a brand like a
Sure.
car, or if it's clothing,
Right.
or yeah, I'm not going to name names.
No, right.
I can tell you that there's a lot of manufacturers that I'm sure they're not happy with a lot of the LinkedIn posts that are out there when people start naming them or going to
Sure.
Glassdoor and places like that. So
Yep.
I really believe that it's gonna hurt these companies if it continues like this, if we continue down that road.
Yeah, I agree. And I think what these laws are really trying to promote is transparency, communication. As Joe said, you know, you have a responsibility if you're going to set up a process that you need to have some outputs and some accountability, right? So I think anything in that direction is a good step. And hopefully it will promote that transparency. Even though we may not have an answer, we can at least tell you we received it. This is where it's at. This is our estimated timeline. You may not get the yes that you want, but hearing nothing needs to stop.
And I think that leads us again into the next question. So looking ahead, what's one shift the talent world needs to embrace? And I think you just hit on it, communication, whether it's tech, human connection, or strategy. If we actually want hiring to evolve, that might be the key right there.
I'm going to add into this one on, I think the job descriptions have to get really enhanced, right? And that really drives a lot of things, right? It drives your AI tools in different aspects, but it also drives what you really want. How many times have you heard, well, that's at least internally, well, this is what I really want, Joe. Well, why isn't it on the job description then, right? So let's get those done more efficiently and effectively. We could really hone in on what we really want. The tools and systems should then hopefully apply to that. And the candidates will have a better experience of, okay, I see why I may or may not be a fit, right? Or why they get more excited about it, because here's the real aspect of it.
Yeah, Joe, what I hear you saying is there are disconnects between what we're looking for and what we really need. So everyone who's part of this process has a responsibility to communicate, really get common ground, common understanding, not only the technical skills, but the soft skills. How will this person be spending their time? And I feel like we've all migrated into this world of kind of more inbox, outbox, rather than really having real conversations. And it shouldn't be, I send you this and you do this with this. And we've automated and made this a very kind of mechanical process where I feel like, having some real dialogue around it is going to solve a lot of issues and make sure you start in the right way and that you are looking for the right people. The other interesting statistic I heard recently was there's this huge fallout rate with new hires in the first 90 days. And I think that this point that Joe brings up is the reason why. Do we really even know who we need and what they're going to be doing? And are we taking the right steps out of the gate to make sure we have that alignment? And I'm sure it's on both sides. It's the candidate saying, this isn't what you told me I was going to be doing, and this wasn't the job that I signed up for. And then on the other side, it could be that, we're trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, and it's all because of this very simple point of really this communication up front and getting this alignment and going through those conversations.
I applied for a job last October, got called for an interview in November. December, they finally got back to me to let me know that they had filled the position. A week and a half ago, that job has now been reposted. I contacted the hiring manager and said, hey, what's going on? Is that job now open, or is this a misprint? No, it's open. That person is no longer here. They lasted not even 1 month. Now, do I know why? Not sure. Maybe what I've heard and talking to a lot of my ghosted by the machine interviews from job seekers is that they look and they say, okay, I'm looking for someone with 5 to 10 years experience, and you got 20 years, or they're looking for someone with 20 years and they don't want to pay that 20 years of experience and they go with some a bit less experience. And then as they get them in, they find out that that person doesn't fit what they were really looking for.
Mm-hmm.
So it just goes
Right.
back
And
to
then let's
communication.
just be real. What does that do for the brand? And then as a candidate, you go, do I want to work there? Did they just get it wrong? Right. Then you kind of have all these worry beads and all these little, kind of things in your stomach going, oh, I'm not so sure about this. Right. But it's a illustration. I think there's lots of reasons it happens. But to your point, there's also a observation that I see in job postings. You read the job description, then it'll say like 5 to 10 years of experience. And I'm thinking, no one with 5 to 10 years of experience could do this type of work, right? So then you get the mismatch of, what is realistic for somebody with that tenure? And to your point, I think the salary range the company wants to pay is driving a lot of the years of experience. So I think when you see that misalignment as an HR leader, as a talent acquisition person, we have to be honest. We're not order takers in a restaurant, right?
Right.
We are professionals who need to say these things don't go together. This is not realistic, right? We need to do benchmarking and other things to help steer our organizations in the right direction and not end up in a situation like that you described, Mark. But I do think having the courage, having people step up, having the fortitude to say this isn't doable, this isn't realistic, and we have to have those real conversations.
Yeah, and there's also way too many companies that are combining roles. So I want this and this, but we only have one rec. So we're going to combine these skills together. And I've been there and in-house and out on the side of that's going to be really difficult because most folks do not have, whether it's a software or a type of experience. So,
Oh, yeah.
That, and you can set the expectation of, listen, that's going to take, there's only a couple of those people maybe out there and I got to go find them and then attract them and then bring them here. So, expectation is this, and we're going to get a bunch of these things. So can we not train? Can we not push? Like you try to do those things, but headcount and budgets just get in, I won't say get in the way, but are affected.
Right. So there's one thing that sticks in my mind, transferable skills. And it's not a question that we had talked about earlier, but it just keeps rolling around in my brain. Transferable skills on some of these jobs that we apply for and how AI just filters you out. We're losing out on that sector. We got people that have worked in automotive that can take those skills and maybe work in technical or financial or in a hospital setting. Is that ever going to change? Do you see us going back to that or looking at that? Because there's a lot of people that are falling off the wayside because they have these transferable skills and they're not getting looked at.
Yeah, I think it's an intentional decision that companies make for themselves, right? Are they willing and are they open-minded enough to make those decisions and invite those people into their organization? Do they look at it as a way to, kind of culture add and kind of bring in different views and perspectives? Or do they just want more people that are exactly the same? But to your point, I think there's also an evolution of that has become something of the past, right? So then candidates say, if I'm not this, and this, I won't waste my time applying, right? So I think it's a hard question to answer. It's a question that companies need to decide for themselves. There does seem to be a trend of people saying, I'm not willing to take that risk. I think it's really all about risk for them. And, I think they're missing out on the potential growth and opportunity that it brings to have people from different backgrounds bring new perspectives in. I know, Joe, you probably got a view on this one too.
Believe me, I've met hundreds of folks that would be great fits. I think it depends on the job, to be honest, right? Transferable skills in a very technical aspect gets tough, right? Because there's a core that they need. But there is a variety of roles, and I think we need that culture add and that culture aspect to it. But you can't do everyone, right? So it's where can you pick and choose that you could add that culture piece and not say take a chance, but it's an educated, plan to go after that person because they're going to bring in these skills that will be into that. And I've spoken to many folks that are transitioning from public to private sector. And there's a lot of transferable skills and they just got to get given that chance. Or you're switching industries. Like you said, Mark, it's, automotive folks into somewhere else, great backgrounds. And, so it's just that alignment. And I think particular roles where those transferables will happen. And someone's just got to get given an opportunity. It's just like an entry level person coming into a company. They just got to get given a shot and they'll be able to get there. So some of that comes into, we're going to unpack a lot of things in that, but compensation, structure, other things, your job scope and plan across, that organization. And so it's a little bit more complicated, but I guess those are the principles I would look at. And then, just give somebody an opportunity as well, right? Because they will probably go above and beyond.
Okay. Well, I've got one extra credit question. What's one misconception HR practitioners still carry into talent conversations that might be holding things back?
All right. So I'm going to go into the recruiting conversation with someone with a talent and a hiring leader that it's easy to find and it's easy to hire. It shouldn't take that long, right? There's all these misconceptions of it. I just said, let's combine these roles. So these misconceptions of we could do this and you can go find these people, and it happens all the time. And that's where the data, the talent insights, the talent pools that you want to showcase back on who's available, what's going on, to be able to go back there and, prove to the leaders, whether it's HR, leadership, hiring managers, here's what we're looking at, here's who we could find, and here's where we can go. But, hiring is not easy. It's complicated, it's tricky, and it's time consuming to find the right person with the right skills.
Yeah. For me, I think one of the misconceptions is that the company dictates the timeline in the process. I will just say that, while you might think that, it's really important to understand that the people that are on the other end of the process, you don't understand where they're at with anything else, right? So I think that the misconception is that there are no risks. There are all these people out there. We're all reading these articles about these high volumes of people looking for roles, et cetera. So I think there's this shifted mindset about really not having to take care of the candidate and provide this respectful experience and timeline and feedback and all those other things. I just feel like it's kind of gone the wrong direction, and companies kind of feel like, well, right? They're in the driver's seat. They're not worried about it. They don't have a responsibility there. And I feel like that's really not always the case. And I think it's leading to some of these ghosting experiences and other things, right? And these branding things. So I would just say, I really think we need to focus more on thinking about being on the other side of this and recognizing that there's a lot of talented people out there. There's a lot of people that are really prioritizing things over compensation, like the culture. How are they going to be treated, right? What is the leadership team like? What is my boss going to be like? So every experience they have that's not a good one in that process, I think leads us down a path of not getting to close and bring the candidate home. So I would just say that I think organizations need to do a little bit of reflection there and think about that a little harder.
That's great. Jill, Joe, thank you both for stepping into the conversation, for keeping it real from inside the trenches. And that's exactly why we do this show, to connect what's happening inside HR with what job seekers are experiencing on the outside. So if you're navigating the job search, feeling stuck, burned out, or confused by the hiring process, and want to tell your story, email me or send me a DM. And if you want to stay plugged into the real stories, real insights, and real humans behind today's hiring system, make sure to follow and subscribe for new episodes, shorts, and conversations every week. And if your organization believes in making hiring more human and wants to support conversations like this, we're currently opening a few sponsorship spots, so feel free to reach out. I'm Mark Lane, and this is Ghosted by the Machine, because behind every application, there's a human. Let's make hiring human again. Thanks again, Jill and Joe.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Mark.